Welcome, everyone, to the first in a four-part series on how to hit top gear for your business by optimizing your people engine through effective learning. I'm Scott Marnie. I'm Chief Strategy Officer for CTech Solutions, and I've had the privilege over the last 25 years to work with organizations around the globe in helping them to unlock the power of learning technology in order to optimize the way that their businesses operate. And it's been a journey that's 25 years. And if we think about the changes in learning, they've been significant. Everything from classroom right through e-learning, mobile, LXPs, extended reality experiences. All of these have been as a result of a convergence of cultural shift and technology and bringing together the best of technology at the time to improve learning. The challenge or the problem over the last 25 years is that some things actually haven't changed. And one of those challenges or things that hasn't changed is our ability as learning and development leaders to actually prove the value of the learning that we're doing. And when we talk about proving the value, we're really talking about proving the value so that it doesn't mean that you're not doing things of value. I'm sure you are, and I'm sure there's so many learning development leaders that are achieving great outcomes. The problem is that when you try to prove or when you try to talk about value and you're talking about value to your stakeholders who you want to invest more into your learning enterprise, it's very difficult unless you're talking the same language. And so a lot of the success that learning development leaders have achieved through the last 25 years has sort of gone unnoticed or really underappreciated because the value proposition in terms of business impact of the learning hasn't been fully understood. And the challenge with that is that if you aren't talking the language of the C-level, which is numbers, then typically they don't want to listen. And that's the crux of the challenge that we face today, is that we need to prove the value of learning as that impacts the people that drive the performance of your business, and through that lens, prove the value of learning through people into the business value that you're unlocking. And that's something that you need to talk about, not just in general terms, but if we talk about C-level, and by C-level, we're talking about your senior stakeholders who have the responsibility for approving and giving you budget for your programs. If you aren't able to talk in the terms of numbers and the impact in terms of numbers, then they seriously won't give you the time of day. And I've seen that time and again where there's been great projects with great potential, but they've been deprioritized or they haven't moved forward as a result of not being able to prove that business impact. And so this series is really about giving you the tools to be able to do that so that you can unlock a greater level of investment and prioritization of your projects than you could have before. So one of the things that I like to ask is, can you prove the effectiveness of your people? And unfortunately, most organizations can't. It's something that is pretty common. And as I said, over the last 25 years, I haven't seen it done very well at all. And so as learning and development leaders, it's something that we should all be focused on, not just on executing on improving our people through learning, but proving that we're actually doing it. And though the days gone by or have gone by of being able to prove it through things like how many completions do we do? What's the average score that people had? Even, what is my happy sheet from doing a level 1 evaluation telling me? That's not sufficient anymore. It's not really proving the business value. And whilst it's very difficult for a lot of organizations to get that information around direct business impact, and that's because most organizations either aren't tracking it or they're not sharing it. The problem is if you don't prove it, then the challenge is that you are in that Wild West, that lawless Wild West where, unfortunately, if you can't prove it, your business is at risk, your L&D department is at risk, and you potentially are at risk. If you can't prove the value of the investment that the organization is making in L&D, then that's at risk, particularly in a climate of cost cutting or cost optimization where everything is being looked at from the lens of value. So if you can't prove the value of what you're delivering and you can't tie that to tangible business results, then you are personally at risk. However, I don't like to look at this from a purely negative perspective. I think there's a lot of positives in this. And really, one of the things that we're really looking to do is to say, look, we want to give you the tools that you can use to now prove value. And by doing that, we're really looking at it from the lens of the people engine. The people engine, which we talk about, is what drives your business performance. And so we want to talk about how learning can positively impact it and nurture it so it can continually be successful as your business grows and changes. As part of this 4-part series, we'll also be looking at people effectiveness. So when we're talking about a people engine, it's obviously made up of people. The effectiveness of those people is really important to measure. And it's not just measuring what you think, it's actually measuring some additional paradigms that we may not necessarily all think about when it comes to how effective people are. But being able to measure capability, motivation, so important to determine and optimize how those people are impacting your business. So that is something we'll be looking at, and that won't be, we'll touch on it a little bit today, but we won't be going into detail on that today. That's more of our second session. We will be talking a little bit today about learning effectiveness, but really I've got a whole session on that going through, well, what is learning effectiveness? How do we actually determine it? And then how do we apply those determinations and those measures to determining how effective our learning is in our organisation, or even at the cohort level in our organisation and beyond? And how do we benchmark that to determine optimization and to determine where we're headed to in terms of a goal for success? And importantly, the metrics that we put in place for learning effectiveness, how they tie back to people effectiveness, and then how they ultimately drive business outcomes, which is really when we're looking at the 4th session, which is bringing it all together around how do we use our people engine, support it with learning to improve the way that we can impact your business, measure it, and then promote it. And that last one, promoting success, is so important because you may have great success. You may have even measured it, but if you're not promoting it, nobody knows about it. If nobody knows about it, it doesn't exist. So it's really important to think about the cycle of measurement or evaluation, measurement, or measurement evaluation, I should say, and then application of those evaluations of measure into a positive impact. All right. If we think about proving value and we think about it from a business impact perspective, there are 2 key hypotheses that we want to look at. So the first one is that effective people drive business goal achievement. The more effective your people are, the more likely you are to achieve your business goals. And that's something that is actually able to be proven. And we can actually see direct relationship between the effectiveness of people and business goal achievement. And that's one thing that we're going to talk about in more detail today. And then, of course, in the second session, dive into more detail around how we can actually measure that. But if we're looking at effective people, then we also need to look at the second hypothesis, which is around effective learning improves the effectiveness of people. And so these 2 work very well together when we're looking at, well, how do we create effective people? We have to provide effective learning. How is effective learning actually measured? How do we define how to create or how to improve the effectiveness of people? How do we curate that as things change in the organization? And this is something that we're going to go into much more detail in the 3rd session, but certainly we're going to talk about that today because that is really the foundation of overall success. And as we look at the next slide, we start to look at learning effectiveness is the thing that ultimately drives your people engine, which really is the engine that is looking at or managing the effectiveness of people. And your people engine and the effectiveness of the people within the engine, people engine performance, which we'll talk about more in a second, is a direct driver of your performance goals. So your performance goals are achieved through an effective set of people that represent your people engine who are supported by and developed by effective learning. And through that mechanism, you achieve your business goals. So the role that learning plays in this process is very important. It's also something that can be measured under any form of people effectiveness condition that you choose to define. And we've got several measures. I've mapped out 54 different learning effectiveness measures that can align back to dozens of people effectiveness conditions. So consider it to be like a matrix, and we'll go into more detail on that as we look at the third session in this series, and certainly when we look at the fourth session in this series where we go through some measurable examples. But the learning effectiveness piece is really important. We definitely need to help drive improvement in your people engine in order to sustainably hit your performance goals. And the ability to measure that is something that we're able to then bring into play with the Learning Effectiveness Index. And that's a way of determining not just where you sit in terms of your learning effectiveness, but benchmarking that. So you can apply those benchmarks across your business, as well as look at other businesses in similar industries and similar regions and countries as you, to determine how effective is my learning in comparison. That's also a great way of looking at promoting your success, or looking at areas that you need to improve upon, so that you can go to your C-level stakeholders and say, right, well, I need additional budget, I need additional resource, and I need prioritization of my projects to help support some of my learning effectiveness measures, because we can see that based on a benchmark of Learning Effectiveness Index, our level is below benchmark for where we need to be for our industry or for our region or combination thereof. And we need to invest more to be able to improve our people engine. And this is the goals, or these are the goals that we're going to achieve from a performance and through performance business level through that investment. That's what we're trying to prove out. And that's what these sessions will give you. They'll give you the foundation. They'll also give you the tools and the process through which you can do that. All right. So if we think about your people engine performance, one of the key things we want to talk about there is that investment. So we really want to talk about the learning investment as it relates to improving capability in your organization. And when I talk about capability, there's a number of different facets to capability that we'll unpick in this session. But overall, learning investment has been shown, but we also need to show how it impacts capability. And that capability needs to impact performance across your roles, functions, or tasks that you perform in your business. So this isn't something that we're looking in a general sense. This is something we can drill down to a very, very specific sense, or you can helicopter back up and look at it from a global sense in terms of how that learning investment is driving capability improvement across your roles, functions, or tasks, which then ultimately strengthens the performance of your people engine. And your people engine is the engine that drives your business success. And that's something that we're going to focus on today, is around your people engine performance. Because intentional investment in your learning intentionally builds capability across your roles, functions, and tasks. And that word intent is very important, because there's a lot of money which is spent on learning technologies, and they're spent on learning programs, and they're spent on research, etc. But they're not necessarily spent with a lot of intent. And having intent around the goals that I'm trying to improve through, say, roles, functions, or task performance that ultimately are linked to business or performance goals and business goals. Being able to do that research ahead of time enables you to apply your investment with much more intent. And that strengthens your people engine performance with much more intent. That invariably results in much more, a much better achievement of goals and much more aligned goal achievement. All right, so all good. We've gotten to this point. Now let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So that's really just giving you some grounding in what we're going to be talking about today. But specifically, we are going to go into what is actually a people engine. We talk about its importance, but let's actually look at what is a people engine, and then how does it impact business goal achievement. And then what we're going to look at is what are the cause and effect components of the people engine, right? And how does that drive performance? And then how do I measure it, right? So how do I measure and improve that performance? And at the end, we're going to be talking about really what is the next steps. Where do we go from here in terms of, this is the first session, what's going to happen in sessions 2, 3, and 4, which is going to take the information you've gathered here the knowledge you've gathered here, and then help you apply it in a much more coherent way. And really that goal is, as I mentioned before, we want to give you the tools, processes, and metrics, right, to improve the performance of your people engine. And we want to use learning as the key lever to help support that. All right, so have any of these things ever applied to you? And I know from my own experience in the L&D world, yes, they have. Right. So, and I see this all the time from organizations I engage with, some of the largest organizations on the planet, and they all have these challenges. Why? It's because there's a problem, right? These are symptoms of a much larger problem. If you're not hitting your KPIs, if your business goals are, you're halfway through the year and you're nowhere near achieving your business goals, or you're suffering from a revolving door of people leaving your organization, they're all symptoms of a bigger problem. And that problem is this: your people engine isn't working as it needs to. It could be broken, or at least it's not optimized to the way that your organization needs it to be continually effective, so you can hit your KPIs, hit your business goals, and retain your talent. So that people engine is an important concept, because I liken it to the people engine powering your business. And I liken that to your business is like a vehicle. So think about a vehicle, a car. Your business is like the body of a car, right? So your business goes from A to B, right? It transports your passengers, which we all are likened to your customers, partners, dealers, distributors, etc. Anyone who uses your products or services as a business to be able to improve their operations, right? Improve their day. So there, if you think about it, this like a bit like an Uber, right? So your vehicle is the thing that actually makes money, because you get in the vehicle as a passenger. You want to go from A to B. You want to do that within a given time frame, and you'll pay money to do that. So it's a business is, or a vehicle is like a business. It does exactly the same thing, right? It makes money, and the outcomes happen of the sum of its parts, because a vehicle is made up of lots of components. Not all of them are inorganic. So if we look at the vehicle and we look at the business takes a direction, and that direction is from the driver. And that driver is akin to your leadership, right? So if you think about the driver says, well, I want these types of passengers, this number of passengers in my car. We're going to go to this direction. Yes, the passengers can say, well, this is where we need to go, but ultimately the driver decides if that's where they want to go or not. And then the driver also determines how quickly they get there. The passengers may provide guidance on that or may demand that, but ultimately the driver is the one that determines if they're going to get there, where they're going to go, and how quickly they're going to get there. And so your leadership is like the driver of the car. Same time, you've also got, think about vehicle design from a business perspective. That's really like your management layer. So your management layer is saying, well, look, okay, we know what passengers we want, because the leadership has said these are the passengers we want. We know where we need to go. We know to a large degree what terrain we need to drive over. We need to know, and we know how quickly we need to get there. So those managers will be really designing the type of vehicle that they need, what performance they need, what capacity they need in order to get those passengers from A to B. So that's important, because the managers, like leadership and management together, help define and drive the next part, which is really when we start looking at the engine. So if we think about the engine of the car, the engine is what moves the car, right? So the engine is what moves the car from A to B. But it doesn't do it by itself. But the engine really, if you think about engines, they're always determined in terms of horsepower or kilowatts. They're determined in terms of capacity. That's, your engine has 200 horsepower. Well, that's greater capacity than, or performance than 100 horsepower. So that capacity represents the power of your engine. Well, people's capabilities do exactly the same thing. So people are like the components of the engine. They have capacity to perform. But that capacity to perform is great. But if the vehicle by itself is a cloud of machinery sitting on the side of the road, right? It doesn't do anything until you put fuel in it, right? You need to fuel the engine, or put fuel in the engine, or put fuel in the car, which is then used by the engine to take that potential capacity that you have and turn it into kinetic action, to kinetic movement. The car will not move until you fuel it. That's really important. And fuel we look at from the perspective of, it's like motivation, right? So motivation fuels people to use their capability, or in this case, the capacity of the engine, to be able to perform the task that's assigned to it. So that's important. And the other side of things is that your engine won't run for very long unless you put oil in it and other fluids to keep it running. And that's about reducing friction. And so motivation isn't just motivation to use your capabilities, it's also motivation to continue to use your capabilities. And that's about reducing the friction in their environment, in their workplace, in the conditions that make people effective. We need to reduce any friction there in order for them to continually be effective in using their capability in alignment with what leadership is trying to do around moving the passengers, and what managers are helping to do in terms of management of capacity. So the vehicle concept, I think, translates very well into what we're trying to do in terms of building a people engine. And I want to illustrate sort of cause and effect here by using, again, the vehicle concept and looking at it from the perspective of, I want to go from A to B, right? And I've got my car going from A to B. And let's just say that A to B, the distance from A to B is 100 miles, right? So I've got to get 100 miles. And my passengers have said, look, I want to go 100 miles. I want to do that in an hour, right? So I need you to drive at 100 miles an hour, which I know is illegal in America, at least, and probably many other countries, most other countries, except for Germany, on the autobahns. But it is a request from the passengers, and leadership might say, okay, tell you what, I want us to go at 100 miles an hour to get from A to B in an hour over 100 miles. However, in not just the design, but in reality, I've only got an engine that has 50% of the capacity to do that. So I can't drive at 100 miles an hour. I might only be able to drive at 50 miles an hour. So if I'm driving at 50 miles an hour and that's all I can get out of my capacity in my engine, then guess what's going to happen, right? I'm only going to get 50% of the distance, right? Or if I slow down and maybe I conserve, even if I don't have enough fuel, right? Maybe I conserve fuel. Maybe I could push my engine, but I need to conserve fuel to get there. It might actually take me twice as long to get there. So that's a real dilemma for organizations that say, well, look, we've got a goal. You need to achieve this goal at 100% of that goal within a certain time frame. But if you don't have the performance in your people engine, you'll not be able to achieve that. And that's a key premise when we look at measuring the performance of your people engine, because it has a direct impact on business goal achievement. We'll give you another example, and this is more from the one where goals change. So if we think about goals, they change all the time. Organizations love to do that because business changes all the time. And the things that are impacting your business will change constantly, which requires you to be agile in terms of adapting to that change. However, if we look at it in the car analogy again, we've still got the same A to B, but you notice something's different in this picture. And that is that now all of a sudden I've got a 20% steeper climb. So that means I'm going up a hill now. It is 20% steeper climb, which means that my vehicle, my business, and more importantly, my people engine needs to be able to operate at 20% higher performance to be able to get up that 20% steeper climb. So that's important because that's obviously, well, do I have 20% performance in my people engine to be able to do that, or an extra 20% performance? And if I don't, then that's going to make that steeper climb hard to do. But wait, there's more. What happens if I actually put an extra load on my car? So in this case, I've actually got potentially extra passengers, or I've got extra load. In other words, I've got an extra demand from my customers who now all of a sudden want more product, and they need more product and they need it yesterday. Well, that's an extra load on your business. And what that means is that not only do I have a 20% steeper climb, So in other words, I've got to do this constant improvement in terms of what I need to deliver, but I've also got an extra load I need to deliver, or an extra demand on my products or services that my people need to support. That means that I need to have even greater power and performance and capacity in my people engine. But what happens if all of a sudden the business says, well, tell you what, you've got to actually go over a longer distance now, right? So it's not 100 miles, it's 130 miles. So now I actually have to keep that car running at higher performance for longer. So I have to fuel it for longer. I also have to ensure that I can actually keep that power down. I can keep that accelerator down to keep that climb rate with the extra load for that longer period of time. So I need greater reliability in my people engine as well. And as businesses love to do again, they love to also say, well, now you've only got half the time to do it in. So now I've got to do this in rather than now, I've only got half an hour I need to do it in. So I've got to actually really push my engine to its maximum performance with all of these conditions occurring. And this is something that's really, really common in organizations, where they keep changing the goalposts, and it's not the organization's fault necessarily. They're just reacting in a lot of ways to business stimuli, to what's happening in the industry, to what's happening with competitors, to what's happening with some of their key customers. You want to retain them, so you have to constantly be agile to be able to pivot. But that agility comes at a cost, and that cost is you need to ensure that you have the appropriate people engine performance to be able to achieve those goals. And it's not static. It requires constant realignment. And if you're not willing to constantly realign, then you're going to fail at some point, right? And so understanding the capacity of your people engine is absolutely crucial to even being able to plan for being able to address these changes. And if you don't know the capacity of your people engine, then you're in the Wild West, right? So not only do you need to prove value, but you also need to make sure that you've got a people engine that can perform in situations where you're going to be pushed, right? And that agility is really important, but also resiliency. So if something happens in the business and all of a sudden we have a 20% increase in demand, are we resilient enough in our people engine to be able to support that? If you don't know, you are really struggling. So understanding your people engine performance and capacity, so important. All right, so we've talked a lot about the people engine. Hopefully by now we understand what the people engine is. Now we're going to start looking at what building blocks that consist of. But before we get there, one of the things we really want to reiterate, and this is important in terms of key messages for this session, is that your people engine performance has a direct impact on people performance, right? It accelerates people performance. It gives you much greater consistency in terms of being able to continually hit your performance goals, even though they may change, even though the road may swerve, right? You'll consistently hit your performance goals if you continue to invest in your people engine performance. And then at the same time, it's the fastest way to get there, right? You can throw a whole bunch of tools and technologies and other things, like you might automate a lot of your operations. You may put AI in place to be able to make better decisions, but ultimately it's the people that wield the tools or make decisions that ultimately drive where your business goes and how quickly they get there. And so if you don't invest in your people engine at the same rate that you're investing in your other tools and technologies, your people engine capacity is going to fall behind. And if that happens, you're not going to get the outcomes of being able to consistently hit your performance goals and do it as quickly as possible. The other thing is, again, you need to consider engine reliability. You have to continue to invest in servicing and maintaining your people engine. Otherwise, it may fail, and it may fail at the time where you least want it to fail. You also need to ensure that your engine is performing. So even if you're not having lots of changes in terms of business goals, how is your people engine performing in alignment with your business goal or your performance goals and business goals? Is it aligned to that? Is your people engine performing in alignment, or is it not? And if it's not, what do we need to do to fix it? So you need to consider constantly consider how effective your people engine is in terms of performance, and then consideration around, do I need a bigger engine, which means maybe I need more people in a certain area. because that area isn't performing in terms of people engine performance versus other areas that are. Being able to identify that and determining whether I need more people or I need to improve the people I have, that's really important. And that's something that should be happening all the time. And that's something that your management and certainly leadership should be considering constantly. And then finally is the bigger goal piece, right? So if my goals change, I might need a bigger engine, so more people, or I might need to improve the people that I have, right? By developing their skills, capability, and motivation in order for them to get to the goal that we now have. So these considerations are really important in terms of investment in your people engine. And these sessions are designed to be able to help you hone in on what do I need to do? Where do I need to spend my money? And how do I get best bang for buck when it comes to my investment in learning and my investment in improving my people engine performance for the best outcome in terms of goal achievement and time to which I can achieve my goal. All right, so now that we've explained a bit about the people engine and the impact that it has on business, let's actually look now at the building blocks for the people engine. So if we think about the people engine, it really is the sum of your individual effectiveness. So people is just a term representing lots of individuals, right? Grouped together under a common cause to achieve common objectives. And if we think about people engine performance, it's really impacted by a number of things. So if we think about individual effectiveness, right? So my individual effectiveness is impacted by churn. So if I think about individual effectiveness, if I'm individually effective, but all those people around me are starting to leave, that will diminish my individual effectiveness when it comes to a group. It may also, or group performance, it'll also impact me personally, because if I've got all the people that I'm actually relying on and I'm working with who start leaving, then I'm actually not going to be as effective because I'm no longer able to rely on them as to help me and support me in what I'm doing. That becomes demoralizing, right? And it demotivates you, which decreases your individual effectiveness. These two things are related, and later on we'll talk about how that individual effectiveness and employee retention rate is then grouped up into people effectiveness. But individual effectiveness is impacted by employee retention rate, which is the opposite of churn. And that, though, is impacted, hopefully in a positive sense, by the effectiveness of your learning. So learning is considered to be an additive property to that combination of individual effectiveness impacted by employee retention rate. But ultimately, it's the sum of individual effectiveness impacted by employee retention rate with an additive property of learning that equals your people engine performance. And this is important because when we start to look at how do we measure this, it's actually a calculation. And when we look at individual effectiveness and what makes it up, it'll be a lot clearer in terms of what that calculation actually represents. But when we look at learning effectiveness, again, when we go through the learning effectiveness session 3, it'll become a lot clearer on how we're actually measuring learning effectiveness. But by being able to put this together into a mathematical calculation, which, look, I know a lot of people, particularly L&D professionals, you start talking math and everyone starts switching off and thinking about other more pleasant things. This isn't complex math. This is actually pretty simple math, but it's very important if we're going back to talking to C-level and getting adoption from C-level and support from C-level for your projects, you need to talk in numbers. So you need to have numbers that are calculated using a formula that isn't complex, but is very understandable. And so I can't avoid the use of a formula, but it's really important to actually being able to empirically measure the performance of your people engine. So we'll go into this in more detail and we'll expand it out in more detail, but really this is one of the crux of looking at people engine performance is being able to measure it in terms of individual effectiveness, retention rate, and learning effectiveness. All right, so if we think about impact on business goals, one of the things we like to look at is people engine performance expressed as percentage, right? So, and we think about it as a percentage of people's effectiveness in their roles, functions, or tasks. And we will go into that in more detail when we look at how the roles, functions, and tasks relate back to the components of of people effectiveness. The higher the percentage score, the better your business impact performance. So if we think about if you've got a low people engine performance percentage, so let's just say you've got a really low percentage, then you are much more likely to miss your KPI and business goal targets. Same thing with times. Well, it's going to take you longer to get there, and you're also less resilient. So you're more likely to be impacted by rapid changes in industry or environmental factors that impact your business. You won't be able to respond to it as quickly because you've got a low people engine performance value. On the other side, if you've got a high people engine performance value, then you're much more likely to hit your targets, hit them much more consistently, also to hit them within the timeframes or even actually hit them earlier and overachieve on your targets. And at the same time, you're much more resilient. And this is proven, and we can see the direct relationship when we start measuring it of people engine performance to being able to achieve those business goals. But if we go back to the previous slides and we look at getting from A to B, I mean, this is really all we're measuring, is we're measuring the capacity of your people engine to be able to perform based around the targets that you've been set. And a good example, right, is that if your people engine performance ranking or rating was 80%, that means you're only going to get 80% of your business goals because your people are the engine that drives your business success. So if your people are only 80% effective compared to what they should be, then you're only getting 80% of your goals, or it's going to take you extra long to get there. So in this case, it's going to take you 20% longer to get your 100% goals. That's something that if you don't know that ahead of time and you agree to goals, you're going to fail. And if you fail, people start looking at you and saying, well, hang on a sec, we've gone and funded your enterprise. We're not getting the targets that we need or in the time frame we need. That's a problem, right? And then that introduces you to risk. And that's the last thing you need. Having said that, if you're able to prove that you've got a high people engine performance ranking or rating, then you can show your leadership that, yeah, you're up for the challenge. You're up for changes in or improvements or extensions or unlocks in business value that you want to attack as a business. So you're up for that challenge because you've got the capacity in the tank, right? You've got the engine power to do so. All right, so let's actually look at individual effectiveness because we talked about it and said it's important. Well, what is it made up of? Well, if we think about capabilities, right? So an engine or people engine is made up of capabilities. Those capabilities are used in conjunction with motivation, because remember we talked before about motivation really being the fuel that motivates the engine or moves the engine. It's also the oil that lubricates and reduces friction, right? Those two things together, right, are what we consider to be individual effectiveness. So a combination of motivation and capability, not either or, both, equals individual effectiveness. And we use a formula to determine that. It's capability plus motivation. We divide it by 2 because there's 2 measures in this. And we want to get to a percentage. So really individual effectiveness is represented as a percentage. So I've got high capability. So say if my capability is 70% and I've got a motivation of 60%, well, I'm going to come up as a 65% in terms of overall capability, which means, or individual capability, which means I've got a 65% chance of being able to hit my targets, or I'm going to take a lot longer to get there, right, and hit my targets. And that's important to know at the individual level, but it's really important to know when we start grouping it up into cohorts of people, and then obviously at the departmental, regional, organizational level. That's really important. So we'll come back to this because this is an important measure, but it's really important when we start looking at it from the perspective of lots of people. So now we can look at one of the components, which is capabilities. And really, when we look at capabilities, this is where we look at it in terms of skills. So if we think about skills, right, skills are really made up of abilities that have been assessed in terms of competency. So for example, you might have a competency level of advanced, and don't worry too much about L3 or even what we call the competencies. It's just a rating scale. right? But ultimately, I've been assessed with a level of competency for one or more skills. So in this case, we might say it's a demonstrated ability, which is a skill, call it negotiation skill, one of those. Those join together to become a group skill theme, which we call capability. So in this case, we've got relationship management. That might be made up of several skills. Some of those might be hard skills, some might be soft skills. We'll explain what they are in a minute. But in terms of the skill, we might say, well, I've got a negotiation skill at advanced level 3. I might have a communication skill, and it might be intermediate level 2. And I might have a listening skill, which might be advanced as well in level 3. And that represents my current capability as a relationship manager, right? That's a very simplistic view, but that's really how we see capabilities is really the sum of skills which have an assessed competency. So it's my ability, which is my ability level for a demonstrated ability. That is my group skill theme of capability. But let's go into what a skill actually is now. So if we think about skills, they're the building blocks of capability. And if we think about skills, they start off with abilities. And abilities are very much your potential. So everyone has abilities. Like I have an ability to drive a car, but it doesn't mean that I am skilled at driving a car. I have an ability to drive the car because I can think, feel, I can hear, I can see, I've got arms, I've got legs, I can manipulate the controls in a vehicle. I've got those abilities. In order for me to say that I can drive a car, well, I need to demonstrate those abilities. I need to get in the car and actually physically drive it. But I can't be certified or say I'm skilled in driving that car unless I'm actually assessed as in a level of competency by somebody who already has that skill, at least at that level of competency, hopefully higher, that assesses me by demonstrating, I'm demonstrating my ability, assesses me for my demonstrated ability against a set of criteria to then say I am skilled at that level of criteria in that ability. And so in this case, I might have a skill, which might be driving a car, and I've been demonstrated to have that ability as a novice level 1. That is my current level of assessed competency. So you think about somebody who gets a P plate, right, a probationary driver's license. They would have been assessed by somebody who would have had a full driver's license, at least, and then some other certifications as well. They would have assessed them to be able to drive a car through demonstrating that ability to a level of competency to say you are now a probational driver level 1. But skills can form into 2 different paths. So if we think about proving the level of your ability, you can prove that across 2 different skill sets. So one of those is soft skills. And if we think about soft skills, I think Burson calls them professional skills. I think about them more as sort of transferable or durable skills because these skills can be used in lots of different contexts and lots of different use cases. They're typically more interpersonal. So if we think about verbal communication, negotiation, leadership, these are all typically soft skills. On the other side of the fence, we've got what we call hard skills. And these skills are much more specialized. They're less transferable and they're much more technical in nature, typically. And they generally are aligned to specific tasks or tools or technical things that you may be doing that are very specific. And so these hard skills can be used in conjunction with soft skills to be able to perform certain roles, functions, or even other tasks. But those skills are all skills because they are demonstrated abilities that have been assessed for a level of competency. And when we talk about skills, that's what we're talking about, right? In terms of this whole presentation. So all 4 sessions will be thinking about skills in this light. Assessed competency in a skill that is a demonstrated ability. And it could be a soft skill, could be a hard skill. And we'll talk more about how they're applied a little bit later on. All right, so we think about skills, they're not something that's static, right? They continually change, and they could be changing as a result of all sorts of different factors. They could be external factors, they could be environmental factors, they could be personal factors. So for example, I might be an awesome surgeon, but I might have an accident and lose a finger. That could actually seriously impact my skill in the surgery. So, that's something that might be as a result of an external factor, but then ultimately becomes a personal factor. I'm not going to grow that finger back. That's very negative. I don't want to focus on the negative side. I want to look more on the positive side. But if we think about skills, right? So my assessed level of competency in my skills, they can go up, they can go down. So if we think about skills that can go down, well, if we think about impacts, they could be as a result of changes to something. So it could be changes to a process or changes to a tool that can impact my current level of skill. It also could be a change to me personally in my example of the surgeon, right? I could have a change where I've lost a finger, right? That materially changes my ability to demonstrate that skill at the level of assessed competency that I was able to do in the past. Also, if I don't use a skill very often, say for example, I'm a pilot and I don't use that skill very often, I really wouldn't want to get into a plane with a pilot who hasn't flown for 5 years, at least not without a check pilot, because you are opening yourself up to all sorts of risks, because not only has that person not demonstrated and used that skill for quite some time, but also may not be across regulatory or other changes that have occurred in that time. And I'll give you a really good example. We had a customer recently who had gone on leave of absence. Prior to going on leave of absence, she was highly skilled and competent in her role in a manufacturing plant. And so they were manufacturing widgets, and she was using her skill, her knowledge, her experience to be able to manufacture widgets at a high rate. She went away on leave of absence and then came back. Unfortunately, she wasn't reevaluated for her competence in those skills and went about her day performing the task she'd performed before, using the same equipment, the same tools, the same processes that she was familiar with. Unfortunately, in her absence, there had been changes to some of the procedures and some of the ways that the tools were used and set up. That resulted in a significant scrap event because this woman, unbeknownst to her, and it was certainly with no malicious intent, was following the old processes, not the new processes. And that change she wasn't aware of, that wasn't also picked up in terms of her level of assessed competency in the skills based around the current processes, not the previous process. And so she unwittingly, failed to use the new processes. And so therefore, unfortunately, the outcome was a significant scrap event, and that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's just one example. I mean, there are lots of other examples you can point to, but these skills need to be actively curated in order for them to be to not atrophy, right? To not change. On the other side of the coin, two things can occur that improve skills, and that is training and experience, right? So training and or experience can be used to not only maintain your level of competency in the skill, they can also be used to improve your level of competency in the skill or even develop new skills. So that constant need to train and use your skills through repetition is so important to ensure currency of your skills. And that's something that, when we think about people engine performance, it's not static, because if we're saying skills are part of the capabilities and capabilities are part of the individual effectiveness, and individual effectiveness rolled up through people is your people engine performance value. If you can't maintain your level of competence in the skills that you have that determine your capability, then your people engine performance is going to suffer. So it has to be constantly maintained. That's constant servicing of the people engine, even without thinking about new goals or new objectives that you're trying to achieve with your people engine. All right, so if we think about the people engine, right, they're part of your business success. It's interesting, so many organizations talk about people as being your biggest asset, and quite often they'll have that in their 10Ks, which in the US is for public companies, it's a disclosure that companies make every year or every quarter on their financial performance, what's impacting their financial performance, how they're operating, what risks do they see, what opportunities do they see. They also disclose how they're operating with their people. And in almost every 10K, one of the statements that's always made is people are our greatest asset. But it's interesting when you see the investment in that asset versus the investment in other areas of the business. they don't always match. And so, if you think about people being the engine room of your business success and they're your biggest asset, it's really incumbent on the business to continually invest in their biggest asset, their people, to ensure that ongoing business success. So if we think about that investment, that's so important to continue to curate. And I'm bringing this up again because, again, it's important to remember that continued investment in building your capability is going to improve the way that you can function in your roles in order for you to be much more effective in terms of your people engine performance. And that intentional investment is so important, right? Organizations need to invest at the same rate as they are in other tools, maybe not the same amount, but at least the same rate that they are in other tools and other processes that they're using to improve their business. Because if you don't, your people engine will lag behind. If your people engine lags behind, it doesn't matter what tools you give people, they're not going to use them effectively, which diminishes the overall investment that you're making in improving your business. All right, so if we think about capability and application, let's look at that in terms of roles, functions, and tasks. So if we think about a typical organization, it's made up of roles, and those roles are made up of functions, and those functions are made up of tasks. And some of those tasks may be actually shared across functions. So, a role, I might be a relationship manager. I might have two functions included in that. So one may be a function that relates back to, customer engagement. Another function may be related back to sales, right? So it might be a sales function as part of relationship management. Each of those might have tasks. So one of the tasks in the relationship or the customer engagement piece may be data analysis. I need to actually understand, the data that we're aggregating on behalf of my customers, so I can actually help make better engagement decisions. But I also may use that data to help with upselling to my customer. So those functions and those tasks are really important to understand and then apply appropriately to the role, because they are then supported by capabilities which are made up of skills at certain competency levels. And those capabilities may be directly apportioned to the role. So you may have many capabilities that are apportioned to a role. You may also have capabilities which are apportioned to functions within that role. So it's not necessarily just a capability alignment to role, it could also be to function. At the same time, you've got skills. And those skills, typically from a soft skill perspective, they are more aligned to functions within a role structure. But they can also be part of skills that are a portion of the task level. Hard skills very much are task-based, typically. So this isn't an absolute 100% hard and fast rule, but this is the typical application of skills. Soft skills at a function level, hard skills at a task level. And this alignment is very important when we start looking at measuring effectiveness, because one of the things we want to look at is, well, what skills do I need for my role, functions, and tasks at what competency level to say that I'm 100% capable to meet the needs of that role? And that's important because that difference between what my competency level actually is in those skills versus what it's needed to be for those roles, functions, and tasks, the difference between those is the difference between 100% individual effectiveness and, say, 50% individual effectiveness. And we'll unpick that shortly. So if we think about targeted capability application, and we think about that from a role perspective, so we've got our capabilities we've said have been assigned to the role. Those capabilities are made up with tasks. And the reason why I've got an N there is we're saying there could be lots of skills that ultimately are underpinning that capability. Each of those skills for that role have a target competency level. So I might have a set of skills that I need. Each of those skills needs to be at a target assessed competency level in order for me to say that I'm 100% capable for that role. Okay? And that's important because anything that you have that's less than that target competency level, or if I don't even have a skill that I need for that capability, then I'm not 100% at my individual effectiveness level for that role. And I bet on the same side, I could actually have more skills at a higher target competency level than is actually required for the role. That's great. I'm effectively overqualified. That's positive, right? It can also create other challenges, but it is positive. Being able to measure that's important, and being able to measure that across both hard skills as well as soft skills. And again, we're talking about hard skills, more proportionate at the task level, and soft skills more at the function level. So being able to measure that current level of skill and competency versus what I need on the task function level rolling up to the role is so important in determining that individual effectiveness. So, and the roll ups really, as we mentioned in the previous slide, tasks to functions, functions to roles. Those relationships are important because they're the things that we'll be measuring when we start looking at sessions 2 and 3, and then obviously proving out as part of session 4 into how effective my people engine is to achieve your business goals. All right, we talked a lot about capability. Let's talk a bit about motivation. So motivation is the partner of capability. It lives alongside it. The two cannot operate independently. They must go hand in hand. So if we think about capability, it's half the equation. And capability is really impacted by motivation because motivation determines how willing and able I am to employ my capability to achieve goals. So I like to think of motivation as my desire to succeed in my role, and not necessarily my role, but just my desire to succeed. But in the context of today's discussion, I'm looking at it from a role-based perspective. So my motivation can be positive or negative. In this case, if I've got low capability, low motivation, it generally leads to lower capability. And when I say lower capability, it could be in two ways. One is I have a lower capability or capability employment. In other words, I don't want to use my capability as effectively as I could because I'm just not motivated to do so. Or I actually don't develop capability that I need because I'm just not motivated to do so. On the other side, higher levels of motivation lead to much more effective and holistic use of capability to achieve goals, as well as developing new capabilities or additional capabilities to be able to expand your overall ability to execute on whatever it is you're doing. And really the key thing here is that motivation directs both capability development as well as willingness to employ it. And highly motivated people are very much employing their capability to maximum effect, right? That's what you want. And motivation is such an important part of this, but it's also something that's typically overlooked. And so that's why when we look at individual effectiveness and then we group that up at a people effectiveness level, we're really looking at how is this person motivated and how is that then impacting their capability to ultimately be effective as an individual. So when we think about motivation and we think about it as your desire to succeed, we actually think about it as a process of, it's really a process. So motivation isn't a thing, it's a process. Because motivation isn't just how motivated do I feel I am, it's impacted all the time by external events. And it's my reaction to those external events that really drives my level of motivation. So if we think about those external events or those extrinsic factors, they could be anything, driven by anything, right? But they can be driven by things like, do I believe in my organization and what they're trying to do? You know, am I doing meaningful work? Am I appropriately paid? You know, do I have the right skills for the role that I'm doing? You know, what's my leadership like? Am I well developed and supported? Can I get work-life balance? There's a whole bunch of things that ultimately are external factors that your organization or the world around your organization may be influencing, right, for the way I actually take those factors on board. So those intrinsic impacts are really, you know, how do I react to what's going on around me? So, you know, if I'm not well led, developed, or supported, you know, I might actually lose joy in what I'm doing. I might actually really start to question my meaning and purpose in my organization. I might not want to progress anymore because I just feel like I'm not being supported to progress. If those things happen, if those things are allowed to happen, then ultimately what's going to happen is I'm going to become demotivated and I'm going to be less willing to apply my capabilities for success, right? For the success of myself and the success of my business. Having said that, a highly supportive, well-led organization definitely brings out the best in people. It actually gives people pride in their roles, joy in what they do. It is actually something that helps them develop new skills. It gives them desire to progress. So they become more passionate It's a feedback loop. So when we think about learning's impact on individual effectiveness and grouping that up into people effectiveness, ultimately at the people engine level, learning impacts all of these external factors by improving them. So for example, if you're not well led, developed, or supported, then we need to address that through effective learning to make sure that our leaders understand what it means to lead, what leadership really means, how to lead effectively, and how to develop and support people. That then improves their ability to improve the way that they lead, develop, and support their people. And if I'm the recipient of that, then all of a sudden I'm actually going to start to feel a lot more motivated when I see my leadership improving their ability to help me and support me. Right. So being able to understand what those impactors are, whether they're positive or negative, is an important way of, or important part of, helping to drive effective learning, right? Effective learning impacting those external factors that are then improving the way that people are motivated and applying their capabilities or even developing new capabilities is so important. And that's something that we go through in a bit more detail, certainly in the learning effectiveness session 3, when we look at how we can identify those areas, hone in on them, and then improve them, and then measure the improvement so that we can see true value in terms of its motivational impact. All right, so if we look at individual effectiveness, this is where we start to introduce learning to the mix. So I talked about it in the guise of impacting motivation, but here we're actually saying also learning helps develop skills. It also helps develop competency in existing skills that you had, and continually helps to curate those the competency in your skills so that you don't atrophy. At the same time, as we talked before, learning has a direct impact on motivation. So it helps with addressing those external factors. It can also help actually address those internal factors. So how do I respond to those external events? Can I get better at dealing with things like challenge and change? And how can I get better at managing work-life balance? They're things that we can actually introduce as part of learning on how to deal with those external factors. But motivation then is used in conjunction with capabilities. And again, I use that X to the N, which is really talking about lots of skills potentially making up those capabilities that you have. So that combination of motivation and capabilities together equals your individual effectiveness level. And it just summarize it really down the bottom there when we look at capabilities plus motivation equals individual effectiveness. So that's something that's so important because it's the foundation of when we look at our people engine. It's really made up of, well, we've got all these people that are individually effective to a lesser or greater degree. That's actually made up of their capability alignment with their roles, functions, and tasks, plus their motivation, right? Their motivation to use it. And that combination is the foundation of our people engine, or ability to measure the effectiveness of our people engine. All right, so if we think about your people engine, how does it power your business goals? Well, if we think about capabilities and motivation, and we think about my individual effectiveness, that's really referring back to a single person. Now, unless you're a very small business, right, you're not run by a single person. Instead, we're really looking at now groups of people that are all individually effective at some level if we average them out. And when we talk about a cohort, this could be for, again, it could be for a manager looking at their people that report into the manager. It could be a department made up of lots of managers with lots of people. It could be a business unit that is made up of lots of different departments. And it could be a regional or organizational view. But ultimately, what we're saying is that people effectiveness is the thing that's most important when we're looking at macro business results, because we're trying to impact at the individual level, but then through groups of individuals, people as a whole. And that multiple people view is important because that's where we start looking at how the people effectiveness piece starts impacting the performance, or the people engine performance ranking or rating. Keep saying ranking. All right, so people effectiveness, what is it? Well, we said it's a bunch of people together, but when we think about people, they have capabilities. Individually, they have capabilities that are aligned to a lesser or greater degree to their roles, functions, or tasks. Well, when we roll up lots of people, we're really saying we're rolling up lots of people in terms of that alignment, as well as their motivation. So individually, I'm motivated to a lesser or greater degree. Again, when I look at that as lots of people, it is that sort of average motivation and capabilities. So the combination of those two things together equals my individual effectiveness. And when I look at those as groups of people, then I can actually see that as my people effectiveness ranking. So my people effectiveness rating, I should say, percentage rating, is really the sum of the individuals. So it's using the same logic, except in this case, when we look at that logic, we have that C plus M, so capabilities, right, of those individuals using the same logic as before, but now we're timesing that by the number of people that we have. So that gives me an overall people effectiveness rating across all the people that we have that were in our people effectiveness measure. So again, we can do that at a small group level. We can do that at a departmental, business unit, regional, organizational level. Any sort of cohort grouping where we know who the people are, you can actually measure their effectiveness in terms of their capability, alignment, and motivation. All right, so if we think about that then, and we think about the overall approach, so that people effectiveness for lots of people times by our employee retention rate, because if you remember back a few slides before, we looked at that individually. So individuals are impacted by employee retention rate for sure, but people are affected even more so, because that employee retention rate, when we look at the entire organization, has a much more aligned impact on people effectiveness than just on the individual. People are a better sample set than one. But that people effectiveness ranking or rating times by your employee retention rate, again, the opposite of churn, plus learning as an additive property across those groups of people equals your people engine performance level. And that's represented as a percentage. So that calculation is something that we dive deep into when it comes to the second session, the third session, and then, of course, the fourth session, which brings it all together. But that people effectiveness ranking or rating times by your employee retention rate, the opposite of churn, adding learning, and then we've got two, because we've got two measures now, two group measures, that equals your performance engine ranking. And that performance engine ranking, that percentage ranking or percentage rating, is used when we look at your ability to achieve business goal targets. All right, so if we think about that, that's the foundation of your people engine. Now let's get into how to optimize it. And this is only going to be a very small view of this. We're going to go into this in more detail in sessions 2 and 3, and then of course in session 4. But how to optimize it? So if we think about people effectiveness and we think about your performance engine, really what we have is we want to set people effectiveness goals, because people effectiveness goals impact operational performance goals. If we think back to those relationships of learning effectiveness, your people engine, your performance goals, and your business goals. So people effectiveness goals may be, I have goals to attract key talent so I can have a more effective group of people, a more effective people engine, because I have actually got more effective people with greater level of capability and motivation. Right? If I do that, I improve my business growth and I hit my business growth goal numbers. If I retain capable, motivated people, right, that improves my people engine ranking, and that gives me the ability to sustain my business goal execution. If I improve the capability of my talent through improving through learning, improving capability, and also improving their motivation, I can also be much more agile. I can take advantage of opportunities or address changes in the market very quickly because I've got a really skilled workforce, because they have that capability and motivation represented by that people engine. If I want a consistent workforce who can do it all the time, again, I have to spend time and energy into curating those skills, ensuring they don't atrophy, but ensuring I also continually motivate my people so I can get the best out of them. My people engine performance can be the highest it possibly can be. And if I continually improve and at least sustain a high percentage value for my people engine, I'm going to significantly reduce risk in my business. reduce risk in terms of typical compliance risk, but also reduce risk of not being agile and not being consistent. So I'm constantly hitting at least my targets, if not being able to pivot and improve and hit new targets. And then if I want to reduce workforce risk, then I need to ensure that I'm appropriately skilling my people so that they have the right skills at the right competency levels for what we're asking them to do, so they're not put into a risk situation. That will also actually improve motivation because they're safer, and that will also reduce the cost of risk, which increases your margins as a business. So these are just some examples. There's many more, but effective people ultimately achieve your business goals. So, and if we think about creating the conditions for people effectiveness, we really are then starting to get into the realm of, well, what are we focusing on to improve? So if I want to increase retention, for example, I've got to make sure people have an enjoyable working environment. They've got to have opportunities. I've got to capture, retain, and share knowledge capital. I can't just keep all the knowledge in one head, because I'm going to get demoralized pretty quickly if I don't have that knowledge shared with me. So I want to improve my capability. And I want to ensure that I have the right skills for the job, right? And aptitude alignment with the job. So that's so important, because if I don't have those things, I'm probably going to leave, and that's going to cause a problem. Same time, if I want to increase attraction, I need to do all the things I'm doing with increasing retention. But importantly, I've got to provide an enjoyable working environment that people talk about in a positive sense, so it makes your organization attractive. But also I've got to provide the opportunities for development. And if you're not doing that, then you're not going to get the right quality of people. If I want to reduce risk, again, I've got to standardize my compliance framework and make sure everyone's trained to it. And I constantly got to curate that. I've got to create a safe work environment, which means people are actually trained and qualified in the skills that they need at the competency level that they need in order for them to continually provide a safe working environment. They've got to be motivated, because if they're not, then they're probably not going to follow procedure. They'll let their skills atrophy, and then risk will start to propagate. I need to obviously reduce my compliance incidents. Again, I do that through ensuring people are appropriately trained, certified, and motivated in order for them to be able to meet their compliance obligation and reduce risk. Improving goal execution. Again, a highly competent workforce improves their goal execution. They constantly achieve their goals, and they're able to do that consistently well. And that sufficient and consistent workforce competency means I can't just train and certify and improve the skills and motivation of one group of people. I've got to do it across a whole bunch of people in my organization. Every manager has to train, certify, and upskill their people. Every department has to do it, etc. And they need to do it consistently well. But they also need to know where and how to spend that investment to be able to do that. So improving goal execution is a great and noble pursuit, but you need to know where to spend your investment to be able to do that effectively. And this is really where the people engine and being able to unpick the people engine starts to bring much more focus to where you need to spend your money and time. If you want to improve agility, right, you need a rapidly developed and maintained workforce. So you need to be able to provide people with capability as quickly as possible. You need to also motivate them as quickly as possible. So you need to do that through a well-structured process. Again, consistent goal execution. You need to constantly be training people so you can skill them, so you can motivate them. That's something you need to constantly invest in and curate. And then finally, if you don't address your workforce capability, and if you don't motivate them, then through the standardized training approach, then you're actually just going to increase cost to your business. But also you're going to reduce cost if you put together a standardized training framework, which can actually then be applied across multiple people. You can scale it well, which actually reduces costs for delivering that training, which ultimately is driving your people engine performance. So we want to create good conditions for people effectiveness. And so if we think about effective learning, it is the best lever that you can pull to improve your people effectiveness conditions, right? If I want to create and sustain a highly competent workforce, then I need appropriate learning programs that can help upskill them. And we'll talk more about what some of these are in session 3. But, I need personal development plans, which are actually helping them develop the skills and competencies that they need, as well as assessing what skills and competencies they have, in alignment with the roles that they have. Being able to undertake skills assessments and gap analysis. That's important because I need to determine, well, where do we need to apply that investment? Induction risk compliance training goes without saying. Job role-based training, again, goes without saying. And on-the-job training is really important as well. So having a systemized, structured way of delivering on-the-job training helps to definitely create, but certainly sustain that highly competent workforce. It gives them constant, aligned skills and the ability to practice those skills at a high degree of competence so that they can be highly capable, not just on the day that they start the job, but ongoing. If you think about measuring that and measuring effectiveness, now we start getting into more of session 3, but this is where we look at gap analysis, not just scope and completion rates, but we actually look at program effectiveness. And program effectiveness is a combination of factors, not just how many people completed it, but how many people should have completed it versus how many people actually did complete it and how did they perform. So there's a number of different components to that beyond just completions and percentage scores. Skills and competency benchmarks, again, against scope and performance criteria. That's really important. And they're key measures to be able to determine whether or not you're actually effective in your learning to be able to develop these people's skills. Time to competency is a great indicator in terms of learning effectiveness. If you're able to reduce the time to competency, that's great because that has direct and indirect benefits to your business. And they are both measurable, particularly for organizations that have performance-based KPIs, where we've got a lot of benchmarking capability there to undertake business value analysis to determine the impact of things like time to competency and time to productivity. And then, of course, we look at the business measures. So, what are the business measures which you look at in terms of absolute measures and trend measures? So how are things happening over time? Is my business output improving? Is my productivity increasing in terms of how many widgets I'm producing? Are my business KPIs improving? Like, is my cycle time improving? Is my yield improving? Is my scrap rate reducing? All of these things are important KPIs to then measure in terms of business impact from the effectiveness of learning. And more importantly, the effectiveness of your people engine. And then things like churn rate, satisfaction trends, etc. And you can look at this across a number of different areas, and I won't go into them in detail, but these areas are really impacted by learning. And so if I think about how a people engine is best improved in terms of its performance, given that a people engine's performance is really made up of 2 key components, which is your capability, made up of skills and competency, and your motivation, right? Learning affects both of those things directly. And obviously repetition, but learning is a big impactor. So effective learning combined with ongoing use of those skills and being motivated to use those skills, right, will be the best way for you to improve your people engine performance so you can achieve these business goals. And as we go through sessions 2, 3, and 4, we'll look at these in more detail, and in particular, look at how we measure these in more detail so you can see the direct relationship between the effectiveness of these learning programs and how they directly impact your capability, motivation, and through that reduce, hopefully, your churn rate or improve your retention, employee retention, that ultimately gives you the best performing people engine you can have. All right, and if we think about going back again, I keep coming back to the same slide, but it's so important. That learning investment, that intentional learning investment is so important, right? And proving that learning investment is impacting both capability and motivation is very, very important because that ultimately drives performance at the role, function, and task level, which improves performance of your people engine, all right? And this is, I keep coming back to it because this is the crux of the discussion, is now we're getting into learning has this impact on capability and motivation. Let's actually now start to measure the effectiveness of the learning impact on capability and motivation so we can see the people engine impact on business goal achievement. All right, effective learning is the best way to unlock success in your people engine. All right, the journey continues. And if we think about what we're looking at next, really it's about how we optimize people engine performance through the lens of individual capability, people capability, and through learning effectiveness. And we'll be going through those in more detail next. So you've really only begun the journey now. We've only given you some very basic overview of what we're going to be talking about in future events, but hopefully it's useful. So if you think about the people engine, hopefully after this session today, you have a much better understanding of what the people engine is. So that people engine is the engine room that powers your business vehicle, right? It takes your passengers that are in the business vehicle, which represent your customers. It takes them from A to B, and it does so with an effective people engine. It does so in accordance with the needs of your passengers, but also the desires and wishes of your leadership. So it'll get them there up that slope with over a longer distance in a shorter time with a bigger load. It'll get them there every time consistently in the time frame that they expect, because you've optimized your people engine performance, right? So we've introduced the concepts of how that works. In the next session, we're going to be going more into how does that look from people effectiveness measures. So we're going to starting to look more into the metric side and determine how they can be optimized and measured. In terms of the next step after that is really looking at learning effectiveness, taking the same approach. But really what we're looking at is two things here. One is how do we measure learning effectiveness across many different dimensions that impact your skill and capability and motivation, and also tangentially reduce churn. But also we're going to be looking at that in the guise of the learning effectiveness index. So how do we start to benchmark that different levels of your business? And then what does that benchmark actually mean? So that's going to be an important component of overall calculation of people engine performance, where we start looking at impact analysis. So session 4 really brings together the other 3 sessions, and it's really looking at, okay, I've got a people engine, it's supported by effective learning. I can measure the learning impact on my people engine. Now let's measure the people engine impact on your business performance. And as part of that, one of the things we want to do, which was said at the beginning of this session, which we typically don't do well, and that is, how do I not just prove it, but how do I promote it? How do I promote it to my stakeholders, my C-level, in a way that they can understand it, but also in a way that can get them excited, motivated, and willing to support my current and future projects and initiatives that ultimately are going to drive the organization much further in future. So hopefully this has been useful. It's come as a result, and it's very high level at this stage, but there's going to be a lot more detail behind this. It comes as a result of, like I said, 25 years plus of experience. It does align to what others are talking about, particularly Burson, 360 Learning, etc. They've all got their own paradigms around skill and competency development. This is really looking at it from a same lens but different, and that is, it's looking at it from the lens of how do we now measure these impacts, and then how do we value these impacts in terms of business performance. And I think that lens is a powerful one, because it's the one that ultimately drives further investment into your learning enterprise. And as an L&D professional, that's something we all want to do. We all want to be showing value, and this series is really designed to help you show value and promote value. So thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions around this, I'm more than happy to take those questions. You've got my email address. You can try my phone number. I'm pretty busy, so that may not always work. But certainly if you send me an email and any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. And I look forward to bringing you the second in our series, which is where we start to dive deeper into people effectiveness. And we'll look forward to doing that very shortly. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.